Hello my darling dewdrops. So this is a different video in which I am sitting here and showing my face because I believe that when you talk about things that you believe, then you should not mask who you are, do you? So excuse me for reading this because I wrote this so I won't get stuck and I won't make mistakes. And in this video, I'm going to try and explain the roots of the rift in our country and what is going on in this country and why it is so hard for me to do readings on the royal family and on other esoteric issues that are very, very important. But right now I'm very invested with topics that mainly concern Israelis. Okay, so let me take a deep breath and get unnerved. So watching the daily grift video today, and I realized that it's very easy to use the same manipulation tactics, whether you are from the conservative camp or whether you are from the radical camp. It doesn't really matter. They use the same tactics, and I will show you in the rest of the video how it's being done here. And this is going to start with a short history lesson, and this whole video is about 30 minutes. So if it doesn't interest you, just skip forward. So let's start with the history lesson. So I suppose you all know that the Hebraic people had a state in the land of Israel during biblical times. And the second state we had was under Roman occupation when Jesus Christ was born. At that time, there were major corruptions of the Jewish leaders. And Jesus was actually going around the land calling people to revolt and to join him in fight against that corruption. And he was actually a revolutionary. But that was why he was conceived as a threat both to the Romans and to the Jewish leaders. And when he was captured by the Romans, despite the fact that the Jewish leaders for Passover, which is the time right now that we celebrate Passover, so for Passover they could have asked for a release of a few Jewish people that were incarcerated. They did not ask for Jesus' release because they conceived him as a threat to their rule. And that is why the Romans ended up executing him. But that is the root of the reason why the Jewish people is blamed for Jesus Christ killing. Okay, so in the year 70 after the count, there was a Jewish revolt against the Romans, and as a result of this revolt, the second temple that was in Jerusalem was demolished, and most of the Jewish people that lived here in the land of Israel were banished, but some stayed. They were Jewish. There are today Jewish families that are the descendants of those Jewish families that stayed in Israel since the Roman occupation in Jerusalem and in Sfat. So some Jewish families stayed in Israel, but most were scattered around all over the vast Roman Empire. So there were large Jewish communities or in many countries like in Spain, in Britain, Italy, Turkey, Greece, the Balkan countries, and in Northern Africa, Egypt, and places like that became later on Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and etc. Okay, so in the 13th century, Britain banished its large Jewish community And there were no Jews in Britain up until Oliver Cromwell became the ruler, and he started bringing back Jews to Britain. So all of this time there was no Jews in Britain. And in the 15th century, Spain and Portugal banished their Jewish communities. Now, those Jews the Jews that were banished from Britain, most of them went to Western Europe and Eastern Europe. That means Poland, Russia, Germany, Holland, Denmark, and Hungary, and those countries. And the Jews that were banished from Spain and Portugal, many of those went to the northern African countries, and some went to Italy, to Turkey, and some went to Holland and other northern European countries, but most went to the northern African countries. So we see here a division in the Jewish people, and the Jewish communities that were embedded in Arab countries naturally were influenced by the surrounding culture. So their Jewish language is called Ladino, and it is based on Spanish. And the music is very influenced by Arabic music, and so is the art and the poetry and the calligraphy and the pottery and everything. And it's important to note that the Jews in Arab countries had very good and friendly relationship with their neighbors and with they coexisted. And up until the establishment of Israel, they had very good relationships with the surroundings, and they, except in very esoteric cases, and in Yemen, for example, that they did suffer anti-Semitism, in most cases they did not. Now, the Jewish communities that went to Europe, they were naturally very much influenced by the European Western culture. So their Jewish language was called Yiddish, and it comes from German. And the music, the art, and even the clothing that you see ultra-Orthodox Jews that wear today, it stems from the clothing that were used in Eastern Europe in the 18th century. And those Jewish communities suffered from extreme anti-Semitism attacks, and there were pogroms that many Jews were murdered. And the Zionist ideas started in Europe because of two factors. The first factor was the anti-Semitism that they suffered, and the second factor was that the national movements started in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, and those Jews were very they were very influenced by those national movements. So the Zionist idea and the Zionist movement started in Europe, and it gained momentum it started in the 19th century, and then it gained momentum in the 20th century. And the first young Jews that started coming to Israel, to the land of Israel, were youngsters from Russia and Poland, that they understood that they had no future in Europe and they wanted to rebuild a country here. So when they arrived here, this land was occupied by the Turkish Empire and was very underdeveloped. There were only a few cities, a few Arab villages scattered around. The roads were very dangerous or never used for agriculture, and they were even happy to sell that land to those sucker Jews. Slowly but surely, the Jewish settlement grew. More and more towns were formed. A new city was formed, Tel Aviv. The Zionist movement in Europe started growing, and richer Jews like the Rothschilds started giving money to help Jewish settlements here. During the First World War, there was an opportunity to end the Turkish occupation in the land of Israel that wasn't so friendly to the Jewish settlement, and to help the British to get control over this land. And some of the Jewish settlers here really formed a small group that helped the British to gain control over this country. They sent them information, and they actually were espionaged for the British. And then the British gained control over the land after World War One. But only during the 1930s, the Arab population here realized that the Jews were beginning to threaten their existence, and they started revolting. And that caused the British to act in a way that wasn't so friendly to the Jewish settlements any longer. For example, they restricted the number of Jews that were allowed to come here. They prohibited the selling of land to Jews, etc., etc., etc. I don't want to get into all of that, but the main problem was the restriction of arrival of Jews here, especially in the 1930s, when it was the anti-Semitism in Europe was growing, and people were looking for places to go to and trying to leave Europe, and they had nowhere to go to. So after World War II, two things happened. So there were many displaced Jews, mostly Holocaust survivors, that they were in refugees camps in Europe, mostly Germany, and they couldn't go back to their previous homes. Anti-Semitism hadn't died, and many who tried to go back, even if just to look for relatives, were killed by angry neighbors or former neighbors. Just a personal story. My Polish grandparents went back to their village, and they knew that they had no family, so they were looking for photographs or for mementos from their families, and they were nearly killed because those neighbors, the ones that were very good neighbors in the past, didn't want them to ask for their houses back, and for other things that were worth a lot of money. Anyway, so no country would accept them, and the British didn't allow them to come to Israel. The other thing was that the fight for the Israeli state started being more active and violent. And Israeli terrorists started with acts of terrorism against the British occupation here in the land of Israel. So these factors made the British approach the UN in 1947 and to ask them to decide what to do. And the UN decided to establish two states, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. So the Israelis accepted and declared the establishment of a democratic Jewish country that will be equal to all of its inhabitants, including minorities. The Palestinians rejected the decision and started a war. So that was our independence war, in which we had to fight not only the Palestinians, but all of the Arab countries that came to their aid. That means Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt. At the same time, all Jews from Arab countries were banished. They were prosecuted in those Arab countries. Violence, they were murdered, and they were banished from those countries. So they arrived to Israel. And that was at the same time of the independence war. So things here were not very organized to accept them. And the country was very poor. And at the same time, Holocaust survivors that lost all of their properties were arriving to Israel as well. So times were tough. And we need to remember that the main structure of the Israeli state was built on settlements that were established by European Jews. So the main social gaps were formed. Now we're talking about people that came from Arab countries. There was a very big language barrier because they didn't know the language, they didn't know Hebrew, many of them didn't know Hebrew, and they didn't know the languages that were spoken in Europe. For European Jews that arrived, at least they knew Yiddish, they knew German, they knew other languages that were spoken by the European Jews that were already here. But the Arab descendant Jews didn't know those languages, so there was this language barrier, and there were other the barriers. There was a very big social gap, and this gap took a long time to narrow. And today these gaps are actually non-existent. So not completely, there are still gaps. We cannot say completely that there aren't, but they are narrowed, very much narrowed. And people like Netanyahu, who is from a European descent, like to perpetuate the gaps. So they like to make people who are not grade B citizens to believe that they are grade B citizens, to make them believe that there are still gaps, to make them believe that they are not receiving a fair treatment like any other citizen. And remember that he is a prime minister for at least 15 years. So for 15 years, he's telling people that there are gaps, that he's the one to close the gaps, but he hasn't done anything to do that. Okay, so he's promising these people that he will save them, and they look at him as if he is at least a god, and that is why they keep on voting for him. So, although he's been, as I said, a prime minister for 15 years, nothing has changed. So, I don't know what makes those people believe that this time he will make through his promises. So, how did this crisis begin? So, this crisis began by, well, first we need to understand how is Israel system is built. So this Israeli system is devised by three main authorities. There is the law forming authority, which is the Knesset, which is elected by the people. And then there is the law enforcement, which is the police. And then there is the judicial authority. And the judicial authority includes the Supreme Court that has power to examine the laws that is formed by the Knesset. And if it decides that these laws are not lawful, it can revoke them. Now, today, the judges in the Supreme Court are elected by a committee that is comprised by members of the coalition, of the opposition, by judges and by lawyers. Now, what we need to understand about Israeli politics is that the dichotomy of right wing and left wing has extra meaning in Israeli politics. And when we talk about Israeli right wing, we also talk about people who do not believe that the Palestinians deserve a state. They actually don't believe that there is a Palestinian people. They strive for a whole Israel. That means to include the occupied territories and the Gaza Strip in the state of Israel. And they don't mean to turn the Arab population that live in those areas into citizens. They want to transfer them. Where to? They don't care. So we talk about people that want the death penalty to implemented for terrorists, but only for Arab terrorists. If a Jew decides to burn an Arab village, he will be considered a hero. So they want to destroy houses of terrorist families and banish those families. Where to? Who knows? We're talking about people who are usually Orthodox Jews or ultra-Orthodox. They want to implement rigorous religious laws. They already started with a law concerning food that is allowed in hospital in Passover. But this is a country where we already don't have public transportation in Saturday. There are laws against work in Saturday. And the ultra-Orthodox community are not serving in the army, are not contributing to the country in any way. Most of them don't work, they don't pay taxes, and they live on stipends from the state that we work and we pay taxes, so we pay for those stipends. But they feel that they are allowed to tell us what to do. So on one side, we have these very right-wing conservative Jews that through groups that are called, very conservative groups, like one group is called Kohelet Forum, they devise laws that will give the government sole power in determining who the Supreme Court judges will be. And in that way, they will be able to neutralize opposition to the rest of the laws that they want to pass, the laws that are unlawful. Those laws about the death penalty for terrorists, the laws about banishing terrorists, banishing Palestinians from Israel. So all of those unlawful laws, they want to pass them, and in order to pass those laws, they need to control the judiciary system. Okay, so but this is not the only reason they want to control the judiciary system. They want to pass laws regarding the way LGBTQ communities are treated, women and other minorities. They want to control abortions. For example, they decided that they don't want to protect battered women. So there was a law that many people worked on for a few years that was supposed to be passed a few weeks ago about putting an electronic tag on abusive partners, and it wasn't passed. It was dismissed, despite the fact that 9 women, since January, 9 women were murdered by their partners. So that is one part. And on the other side, we have Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is standing on trial for taking bribes. So he's scared that he will go to jail. And despite the fact that most of the judges in the Supreme Court today were elected by him, he still doesn't feel certain that he will win his trial. And he wants to control the judicial system, so he won't go to prison. So both of these factors together created the current situation where many of us, not only left-wing, but also central people and right-wing, who never meant for this to happen, feel betrayed. We know that once the Supreme Court loses their ability to revoke unlawful laws, then the ruler has uncontrollable power, and that makes a dictatorship. And as you know, every fascist regime has its own police force. In Italy, it was called the Black Shirts. In Slovakia, it was called the Hlinka Guard. In Nazi Germany, it was called the SA. In Israel, they already voted on the establishment of the National Guard. So today, the National Guard. So today and this whole week is a holiday in Israel. And in the past 2 days, we celebrated the freedom of our ancestors when they fled Egypt on the way to establish the first Israeli state on the land of Israel. And our enemy started firing rockets on us from the south and from the north. So they are not stupid. They are very smart and they can feel our weakness. So can we heal the rift? Can we join forces to fight our enemies from our outside? That is a very good question. The bigger question is, can we fight our enemies from within? So this is it, and I hope you can understand my situation, and I will try to start doing readings again and start posting readings. I am trying to keep on myself on top of things, and I am excited for the coronation. And I am excited that King Charles decided that Harry and Meghan will not be on the balcony for the coronation. So I will see you in my next video. And up until then, I hope you enjoy this, and bye.